Good day. I hope this finds you well. Today we want to talk a bit about international trade. International trade is a fascinating subject. What is international trade? Well, it's basically one country selling whatever they make to another country. It's also that country buying from any other country something that they make. What is the benefit of international trade? The benefit of international trade is, and the hope, is that a country that does something particularly well, let's say makes tires, they make tires particularly well, maybe they have more rubber, or the production facilities, or the talent. So they're able to make many more tires, or much better tires. So that country should produce tires, but maybe there's something that they don't make very well. For instance, picture frames. So maybe another country makes picture frames particularly well. Trade benefits both countries when you do something well and you produce that product and you sell what you produce well to other countries and you buy what you don't do well from other countries. Since those that make tires can make many more tires because they're good at it, and those that make picture frames, the other countries, can make many more picture frames, the world benefits than if each country made tires and picture frames themselves. They would both not make enough picture frames and tires totally than if they were to each make what they're good at and then trade. So trade is highly advantageous as long as trade is fair. We often hear about free trade and fair trade. Free trade means that there's very little restrictions between countries. So that means that if a country buys a product from another country, they don't have to have quotas or tariffs. Quotas and tariffs are artificial barriers that prevent one country trading with another country. And some countries want to prevent their products or products coming from other countries into their own countries because that inhibits that country from building something. For instance, picture frames. If one country is not good at picture frames and another country is, then they would keep importing picture frames from that country. If you had a picture frame industry within your country, that industry would not do well because you're importing picture frames from another country. So production, i.e. employment in that country, would not be beneficial to those in the country. So some countries, if you're the picture making industry in a particular country that doesn't do well, would want you to prevent importing picture frames from other countries so that people working in that country can work. But if one country restricts trade, then the other country will restrict trade as well, and we would have what's called a trade war, which is not beneficial to both countries because then you're not going to produce as many picture frames and as many tires. So trade is increasingly important. And the United States has done very well in terms of trade for a quite number of years. In fact, it all started after World War II. What happened was that the United States was one of the preeminent architects of trade and one of the preeminent beneficiaries of trade in the world. Mainly because after World War II, most of the other countries are decimated, from Russia to Japan to the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Germany. They couldn't produce much because much of their country was destroyed through the war. And in fact, there's a couple of great statistics that talk about the dominance of the United States during and after World War II. In fact, just before World War II, U.S. unemployment was around 30%. Towards the end of the war, our unemployment was 1.2%, the lowest this country has ever seen. The United States built and launched more ships in 1941 than did Japan during the entire war. That's really an amazing statistic that we were producing so many planes. In fact, the United States provided almost 2/3 of all the Allied military equipment produced during the whole war. One country produced that. And it continued in the post-war. That's when these companies by the name of AT&T and NBC and CBS and McDonald's and Kodak were all created, or at least they came to prominence. After World War II, in fact, the United States was responsible for about 40% of the entire world's goods and services. We only have about 6% of the population, but produced 40% of all the goods and services. It's an amazing statistic. In fact, we produce 75% of the world's vehicles. Can you imagine if we produced that many vehicles today? And so we've seen that this growth, especially after World War II, in international trade, the combination of imports and exports. In fact, in the 1800s, only about 2% of the world's gross domestic product, if you added up everything that was sold in the world, only about 2% of it was an import or an export. Most of what was made was sold in that same country. By 1970, that figure was about 28%. So it went from 2% in 1800 to about 28% in 1970. And in fact, it's over 60% today, which means 60% throughout the world, 60% of all the goods and services is either an import or an export. That's how much trade is. The United States, which benefited so greatly after World War II and really dominated the market because we were the only game in town, we saw around the 1970s, somewhere around that figure, actually the figure is about from 1969 to 2009, America's share of world trade did not grow very much, even though world GDP tripled. World GDP tripled during that time, but America's share of GDP did not grow as much during that period. That's because these other countries, Japan, Germany, Russia, England, all grew their economies substantially. The United States didn't. So there are promises and perils related to international trade. Not everybody benefits equally, but the hope is if each country, just like each person, does what they're good at, and they sell what they're good at, and they buy what they're not good at, then both sides will produce more products and services, and everybody will benefit, as long as it's free and fair trade. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the day.